Hey, everybody, this is Mike Miller, and welcome to Strike Up the Band. Today on the show, I've got Dr. Joel Collier from Columbia, South Carolina. Joel is a multi award winning composer and euphonium soloist, and just a really excellent player. And we're going to learn a bit about his career and his composing and his playing. And I think he's got a little bit of surprise he's going to tell us about somewhere during the show. So, Joel, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Cool. Tell me where you're from and where you grew up and started your music career or music
Yeah.
journey.
I'm from Philadelphia. I grew up there. I lived there all the way through my undergrad. So Philadelphia really is home. Um, and That's where I definitely started this whole music journey for me. It was a family thing. My parents actually met playing in a brass band together. That was always part of our upbringing. I also have two brothers. I have a twin brother and I have a younger brother. And the three of us all took to music pretty young and pretty well. And our family used to play together actually as a brass quintet and sing together and things like that. So we actually did several performances as our family. So we grew up doing that. I also grew up in the Salvation Army. So I also grew up with that background doing Salvation Army brass bands. Most of my musical training before college was just Salvation Army bands. So I had the opportunity to play in several Salvation Army bands in Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania area and do several events with the New York Staff Band and several summer camps through the Salvation Army that really pushed my brass band training. That was all my upbringing in Pennsylvania in the Northeast before I headed off to other places after I finished college.
And where did you go to school?
So I did an undergrad at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I studied music industry, specializing in music technology. My parents, my parents were not career musicians; they're both hobby musicians, very excellent hobby musicians. But when my brothers and I decided we wanted to go into music, they kind of pushed us to say, okay, we want you to have a marketable skill, not to do a performance degree for your undergrad. So my twin brother did music education, and I decided if he was doing that, I was not. So I did music industry with my eye on writing music for film or radio. But I also learned a lot about live production and studio production in the process as well. Then I went on to graduate school after that and finally did my performance degrees I wanted to do in the first place.
Okay. Well, I can tell that the performance degree must have worked because I watched your video this morning of you doing that Tchaikovsky violin concerto.
Yeah.
And all I can say is, holy moly. And that's the nice version of it. That was an impressive piece of playing there.
No, I appreciate it. That was part of my doctoral program at JMU. That was one of my doctoral recitals. So I did both my master's in euphonium performance and my doctorate in euphonium performance pedagogy and literature at James Madison University in Virginia, studying with Kevin Stees. And those 5 years, let me tell you, I walked in with a decent level of performance ability and a general idea of what I knew what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be about. But let me tell you, those 5 years dramatically changed my trajectory, dramatically changed my playing. I definitely have Kevin Stees to thank for that. He kicked my butt in the best way.
Yeah, that's some good playing. You mentioned that you grew up playing the Salvation Army bands. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm not really familiar with that whole system very much. I know I guess I've heard of that New York Staff Band, and but I don't. At least up here and where I live, I don't really know of an active Salvation Army band. Maybe they're out there and I just don't know about them.
Yeah. The Salvation Army, for those who don't know, any listeners who might not know, the Salvation Army, in addition to being a charitable organization that does all the things like emergency services, the Salvation Army is a church, and that's how it was founded. And so all the charitable stuff actually comes from it being a church. And one of the traditions, because the Salvation Army came from the East End of London in the late part of the 19th century, it kind of grew up at the same time that the brass band tradition was also growing up. And they kind of grew up together with brass bands being kind of the attention getter that the Salvation Army would use to get people to come listen to them. So Salvation Army banding became a very big tradition in the Salvation Army. In each local Salvation Army would have had its own brass band. Instead of an organ, they would have used a brass band to accompany the hymns and the singing and things like that. It kind of had its heyday in the US. Like the peak would really, I would say, is like in the 1950s and 60s would have been the peak of that. It has kind of died off some since then, but there are still some Salvation Army locations that still have really, really good and really large brass bands. And they use them every Sunday in their church service instead of an organ. But they also have these other bands. So I grew up in the Eastern Pennsylvania and Delaware division. So in addition to playing in my Salvation Army Corps band in Philadelphia, I played in the divisional band, the Pendel Brass. So we met one Saturday a month to rehearse, and we would do multiple concerts a year and go on tour. I've gone around the world with different Salvation Army bands. I played in the National Capital Band in DC while I was in graduate school. And then there's the idea of the staff band, like you mentioned, the New York staff band. And there are very few staff bands in the world, but they are kind of considered the pinnacle of Salvation Army music making. Those bands are audition process, and they're tough to get in. It's really just like the cream of the crop for all of those bands. There's the International Staff Band in London, New York Staff Band, Chicago Staff Band, Canadian Staff Band, and a few others where it's a tough audition process, but those are kind of the pinnacle of Salvation Army music making.
And do they follow the same instrumentation as the traditional British brass band?
Nearly identical. There's only one difference in Salvation Army scoring from those bands to the British contest bands, and that is the part of Repiano cornet. There is no Repiano cornet part in most, I'm going to say it used to be all, now it's most Salvation Army literature. So that is the only difference. Otherwise, they are exactly identical.
Okay. And I guess those bands tend to play more sacred music when they do concerts, or is it kind of a mix?
It can really be a mix. In fact, a lot of Salvation Army published music is most of it is sacred, but they also do a lot of classical transcription. So that's always been a part of Salvation Army music making. I remember playing Franz Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 in a Salvation Army band. So that was an adventure. But they also play a lot of the music. I've seen Salvation Army bands play other just popular things like the New York Staff Band in particular used to play the song New York, New York quite often. Other things just to kind of capture the attention or things like that. And one that was recent, popular song, I know Pharrell Williams' Happy was one that a lot of Salvation Army bands would play. And they'll sometimes play some of the contest literature. So things like Tritico by James Curnow and things like that. So it's really a mix. It used to be a policy up until the 1990s. It was a policy that Salvation Army bands could only play Salvation Army published music, and non-Salvation Army bands could not play. It was a very strict policy, but that policy was lifted in the late 90s, and now the bands can play whatever they want, and any band can buy Salvation Army published music.
Yeah, I think I've seen the website. They've got a lot of stuff for sale there.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any bands in the Southeast?
There are. There's the Southern Staff Band, which is actually a new staff band designation. When I used to play in that band, it was called the Southern Territorial Band, and that's based in Atlanta. There are several decent-sized Salvation Army Corps bands in Florida. There are some here in the Carolinas as well, but they wouldn't be as big. I know that there are a few around, but they might have a dozen members instead of a full band. Okay.
So you grew up brass banding. Is that what led you to go to James Madison?
It is. My senior year of high school, I joined Atlantic Brass Band in New Jersey. And we went to the North American Brass Band Championship that year, and we were playing against JMU. And it was the first time I had ever heard of James Madison. But when I heard that band play, I thought to myself, man, they're doing something right there. And so I just needed to know, and then proceeded over the next several years to compete against them. And again, just be floored every time listening to this group of college students compete with the top brass bands in the US. So when it came time to determine grad schools, it was kind of a no-brainer. That was one of only 2 U.S. schools that I even considered for my master's degree, and it was specifically because of knowing about them because of the brass band, but then also getting to know Kevin Stees and his teaching style and seeing what students of his studio have gone on to do. Really sold the deal for me between the brass band and his studio, and he's also the director of the brass band, so I got to work very closely with him my entire time there.
How did that particular school happen to end up creating a brass band? Do you know?
Yeah,
that's not something you see every day.
No, it's not. So they used to have a brass ensemble, as most colleges do, and what they did, again, Mr. Stees, when he was in undergraduate school at, I want to make sure I get this right. I want to say Illinois, and I really hope that's right. If he's listening, he'll correct me if I'm wrong. When he was there, James Kerno was working at that university, and he did a brass band at that university. I think it was only 1 year or 1 semester. It was a brief time, but Mr. Stees played in the brass band there with James Kerno. So that kind of gave him the taste for it. And then fast forward to, years later, Mr. Stees is a tenured professor at JMU, and he's directing the brass ensemble. He has the idea based on his past experience, but also some of his exposure to the brass band literature in the intervening time, to turn his brass ensemble instead into a brass band. He had started using some of that literature with brass ensemble and kind of asked himself, why don't we just turn this into an actual brass band? And that's what he did. He kind of did it unofficially at first, but it took off, and he did very well, started bringing them to the brass band championship, and they were competing well, and it kind of just blew up from there and became one of the flagship ensembles for that music school.
Brass banding in the U.S. Seems like it's growing recently. Would I be accurate in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first joined NABA, the North American Brass Band Association, back in 2007, that was my first exposure to the contest band world. I had just known Salvation Army bands up to that point, but doing the contesting brass bands, that was my first exposure. And since 2007 to now, it has been absolutely an explosion of new bands. I hear of new bands being formed all the time, universities that are creating brass bands, and it's definitely a growing medium in the United States. For a long time, there were almost no brass bands in North America besides Salvation Army bands, almost none. There were a couple that kind of survived. I believe the Weston Silver Band in Canada has a long-running history. But I mean, back in the Civil War, a lot of those bands, the Civil War bands, were essentially they were brass bands. They were using sax horns, all the stuff that you need to qualify now as a brass band. They were kind of already doing that in the American Civil War. But with the rise of the concert band, with Sousa and all that stuff, the brass band basically died away. And it was really only in the Salvation Army that brass banding continued in North America. But in the 80s, there were some people that got together and tried to revive this idea. There were a few bands that had been founded, and they just decided to revive this idea. And that's where the North American Brass Band Association came from. And it really was just a handful of bands at the time. And to be very honest, overall, the standard at the time was not very high. But over the intervening years, there's been so much growth, so much. At first, it wasn't even numerical growth. There was numerical growth, but it was a growth of the standard. The pieces that the test piece from 2007 when I was first in championship section would never be a championship section test piece anymore. It would be first section or possibly even second section. Just the standard of playing in brass bands in North America has increased so much. And then the numerical growth has been recent as well, but it is really exploded. I see it starting to take off even in not only universities, but in high schools. I have a friend that he runs a middle school band program, and he starts all of his students off on cornet and runs it like a brass band program in his middle school band.
Okay. So he doesn't have any flute players then?
He does not.
Sounds like a good band to me. Yeah, I think as I told you last week, and that's what kind of led up to this podcast, is we are just in the process of trying to get a brass band started here in Spartanburg. Had our very first meeting / rehearsal last week, and actually we had about 35 people turn out, and I think it's going to be a really good thing. Had some excellent players, and so I'm really looking forward to that. So when you got out of school, what did you do?
So when I first finished my doctorate, I worked for 6 months in Fredericksburg, Virginia for the Salvation Army there as a music director for specifically Fredericksburg. And then 6 months later, I got hired as the divisional music director for the Salvation Army for all of Kentucky and Tennessee. I did that for several years, where I was running my own summer camp, summer music program, running my own Salvation Army bands, and helping all these different locations with their music programs. And I did that from 2017 until 2021. And then in 2021, I moved to where I am currently, which is assistant professor of music at Allen University in South Carolina.
And I guess you were instrumental in helping start the South Carolina brass band down there as well, right?
Yeah. So the South Carolina brass band, that by name, existed, I think, technically in the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. Nick Fife started that, but he started that really as a brass ensemble with trumpets, trombones, French horns, all that stuff. And that's how they had started that. And then obviously with COVID, that very quickly went into them just doing virtual YouTube videos and things like that. And then when I got here, I had a conversation with JD Shaw at University of South Carolina, and he had a lot of interest in getting a brass band started. So he and I were talking about this idea, and he got wind of the name South Carolina Brass Band already existing for this ensemble and already had a connection to Nick Fife. So he reached out to Nick, and we had a meeting to say, hey, can we kind of marry these two ideas together? So that's kind of what we did, is we took the name South Carolina Brass Band, and we took his business model that Nick has, and he is actually still the CEO. He's the one in charge of the business, but then brought on myself as the artistic director and JD as the music director. And we turned it into a brass band, and it's been thriving. That was in the spring of 2022. And we've done that spring season, and we did our fall season, Christmas concert. Now we're into our spring season of this year. And we're taking a small ensemble to the NABA championships this year as kind of a precursor to getting the whole band there in the near future to compete.
Cool. I think for people that have not listened to or participated in a brass band, I think the most amazing thing is just how hard some of that music is. I mean, they give those trumpets, cornets, all those violin parts, and just say, go at it. And it's some very challenging music, especially compared to most concert band stuff, and certainly compared to what you play in an orchestra. Even though in the orchestra, I'm not saying the orchestra is easy. There's some good stuff in there, but you're never going to get the kind of stuff in an orchestra that you get in a brass band.
It's the reason I play euphonium, actually, because I grew up seeing brass bands, and the principal euphonium in the brass band is the number 2. It'd be like the principal cellist in the orchestra. You have your concertmaster, which would be your principal cornet, but something about the sound of the euphonium just captured my attention immediately as a kid. And they have in some ways the hardest parts in the band. So it was just really, it seemed very fun and exciting to me. So that's why I play euphonium.
Yeah, I'll say I own a euphonium, and I have played euphonium in concert band, but I don't have the fingers to play most of that brass band stuff. I'm primarily a trombone player. Uh, did you ever consider like going for a military band career or anything like that?
I did once when I was still in my undergrad, my sophomore year of college. I took an audition for the U.S. Navy Band in D.C. And made it through the preliminary round, went to the live auditions, and I did not. I've always kind of been a big guy, and I just missed the weight cutoff for weigh-in that day. And I kind of decided that was kind of the end of the line for me with the military band thing. And actually, that audition was a no hire. And then about 2 months later, 3 months later, they did it again, and that's when Bobby Barron got his spot in the Navy band. So that was kind of the end of the line for me on military bands. I kind of realized at that point, listen, if I worked as hard as I did to make weight and still didn't make it, maybe this isn't the thing for me. But I have a lot of friends that do that. I spent a lot of time in and around DC because of graduate school. So I have a lot of friends and connections that are current and former members of especially the DC bands, but also a West Point band and things like that.
Yeah, I guess the U.S. military is probably the number one employer of euphonium players in the country.
I do believe that is actually correct.
Let's see. You want to talk a little bit about your composing career and things you've done in that area?
Yeah, that has been a fascinating development as well. I've always written music. I kind of had a knack for it. My parents kind of discovered that fairly young. I was such a music nerd. I loved music theory. And if anybody listening knows Chose Music, they had the Master Theory books. There were 6 books that took you from This Is a Staff to Harmony and Arranging by book 6. And I was kind of pushed. I really always loved that. I just gravitated to it. And I finished book 6 when I was 12. And my parents kind of had to figure out, okay, well, what do we do now? And they were really good. My mom was working for the Salvation Army as a music instructor at the time. And her boss was a guy named Dr. Harold Bergmeyer. He was a big mentor in my life. He directed the bands that I was involved with at the time. And he has his doctorate in music theory and composition. So he kind of took me under his wing. We would do occasional, not anything regular, but we would do occasional lessons in theory and composition. And I remember my early projects would come back covered in red pen from him, but we would sit down and talk about scoring, particularly for brass band, but also some for choir. We'd talk about scoring and we'd talk about compositional techniques and things like that. And I wrote a few little things that would get used here and there, but it was always I would write something and have to bring it to somebody and say, hey, I wrote this. Could you please take a look at it? And very often, they would humor me and, they'd read it once or twice and then shelve it. But I remember there was a piece that I wrote when I was 16 years old. That was an arrangement of a Sidney Cox song. It was called Deep and Wide, and I wrote that. And that was the first piece where I actually brought it to Harold. We had worked through the compositional process together, but I brought it to him and he said, this is good. We're going to play this. And we played that in the Pendel Brass. But also that was when I had joined the Atlantic Brass Band, and Atlantic, they humored this 17-year-old kid. And we played that on one of our programs right before it was our NABA preview concert, actually. And we played that on that program. So that was kind of the beginning of getting music played. And I had my first published piece, which was actually a choir piece. It was published when I was 19. It was something that I had written when I was 16 that I used for my entry material into Pennsylvania Governor's School for the Arts. So it was funny that my first published piece is choral, and I only have one published choral piece. But in the brass band world, again, I continued to write and I would continue to show it to people. Dr. Dorothy Gates also kind of stepped in as a big mentor in my life for composition. She would give me a lot of really good feedback on the pieces that I would write. And so the two of them, Harold Bergmeyer and Dorothy Gates, were very influential in my writing career through college and into graduate school. And then I had kind of what I would say was my lucky break. When I finished graduate school, I had written a piece called "Thy Matchless King," and I submitted that for publication to the Salvation Army in London. And they wrote me back and said, "We're really not sure that this works. The scoring, blah blah blah." Their feedback saying, "We're just not sure." But I sent it to a friend of mine, Derek Lance, who is now the director of the New York Staff Band. And he said, "Yeah, we'll take a look at it." And they ended up performing it on several concerts, and then ended up recording it. In addition, they recorded that and another piece that I had written called "Christ of Calvary" on one album. They recorded both of those works. And then the same year, the International Staff Band in London recorded another piece that I had written called "He Watches," which was the runner-up for a brass band composition contest. And from that point on, with those two bands recording those three pieces, that is when all of a sudden I started getting commissions. I started being asked for pieces by bands, by individuals, by organizations from around the world, based on that explosion of attention from those publications. New York Staff Band's next recording, I had a track on there. I think their next two recordings, I had tracks. They've now published several of my pieces. They're currently performing several of my pieces in their repertoire. Derek and the New York Staff Band have really been a big proponent of my music. But then other pieces that I've written, including one I wrote for them called Epeinos, was used as the third section test piece for the North American Brass Band Championship last year. It's just been kind of this crazy journey. Now I'm writing a lot of commissions for soloists and for smaller ensembles, and still for brass bands as well.
That's great. As a non-music major who doesn't even know beans about theory, I'm always impressed with the people that can write music. So, now what do you do there at Allen? Are you direct ensembles, teach lessons, all of the above?
Yeah, kind of all of it. It's a small music department, small school altogether. So there are only a few music faculty. There are 4 of us. So we share a lot of responsibilities. I teach several lecture classes like composition and careers in music and things like that. Conducting, which is a fun one. I actually enjoy doing that one. But then I teach the whole brass studio, which is not that many students, but I teach the whole brass studio. And then this semester, I direct the jazz ensemble as well. Sometimes, depending on the semester, I also have sometimes responsibilities to direct the concert band or be the assistant director for the marching band, or any combination thereof.
Okay. All right. And you had a recent experience, which I'd like for you to tell our listeners about, as far as a rather well-known brass band.
Yeah. So the Corey band, this has been quite the journey. In November, the Corey band posted a vacancy for second euphonium. And I thought nothing of it. I mean, I see those vacancy postings all the time. But then some friends of mine texted it to me and said, "Hey, look at that." And some other friends of mine then tagged me in the posting on Facebook. And I finally thought, you know what? Why not at least send an email? If I don't reach out, I'll always wonder what if I had reached out. So I wrote to Philip Harper and expressed my interest in the vacancy, thinking that as an American, that was the end of the line. But he wrote back and asked for me. Basically, he said, "Well, before we kind of entertain this idea, we need to hear you play. Can you record some videos for us?" So I recorded those videos and sent them back, again, thinking that would probably be the end of the line. You never know. And they wrote back to that and said, "We appreciated your videos. They show some promise. So the next step would be having you sit in with the band. But we recognize the difficulty of that with you being based in the US." I wrote him back. I said, "Well, actually, I have flights booked to come to the UK to visit my son. He lives in London with his mother. I said, so, I land on December 15th. And is there anything that can work? They said, December 15th is our last engagement for the year. Can you be in Wales that night? So I did. I traveled, landed in London, rented a car, drove to Wales, played an audition for Philip Harper and Glenn Williams. Kind of had an interview with them, and played a concert with them that night on no rehearsal. And now I'm in the process of taking those next steps to become a full-time member of the Corey band. That's still in process, but that's where we are now. I actually just gathered the last of my visa materials today to apply for my global talent visa. And if everything goes well, if I'm doing a short stint with Corey band in March, and then if all of that goes well and my visa goes through, then in May I'll be headed over there full time, and we'll see where it all goes from there.
Yeah, that's wild. So for people that just may not be familiar, tell us about Corey and their reputation and where they stand.
The Corey band is again, brass bands by their nature, they do a lot of contests, and so those contests being scored, there's a website, and there's multiple websites that kind of rank them based on their performances at these contests and things. But the most popular one is called 4 Bars Rest. And if you were to go on 4 Bars Rest right now and check out their world rankings tab, at the top of that, you will see #1 Corey band. They are the #1 brass band in the world. They have won so many contests. They've won the Welsh regional contest, UK national contests, European brass band championships. They've won so many contests, especially over the last few years, since Philip Harper has been there, and even a little bit before he got there when it was Bob Childs. They've been really one of the best brass bands in the world for a long time, but for the last several years have been ranked #1 in the world.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And the thing I find interesting about it is I had a chance to hear them in Raleigh a few years ago. I don't know if you were at that show, but just an amazing concert. And you read about them and you find out that none of these guys get paid. And so they all have like real jobs somewhere, and they get together and play at just this incredibly high level. That's what really amazes me.
That's part of what I'm working on right now is, to go over there, I actually have to find a job to go play in the band. I have to find a job. So it's just a fascinating thing. But yeah, they actually were just last year, were given a Queen's Award for voluntary service because everybody in that band volunteers their time to play in that band. Yeah. And let me tell you, sitting in that band for that concert on December 15th, nothing prepares you for sitting in that band. That first chord of the whole concert was this tutti band fortissimo chord, and we hit that chord, and I just thought, okay, here we go. It was unlike any sound that I had ever personally experienced just sitting in that ensemble. So I'm very excited at what lies ahead.
With your experience and knowledge and talent, it seems like they'd be able to find a job for you over there somewhere.
Yeah. So I actually just applied for one yesterday, so okay. I'm not too worried about it. The first step is the visa. The particular visa I'm applying for is not attached to any job. So now I just need to hope the UK government determines that I have enough merit to grant me the visa. And then I'm sure a job will come after that.
Yeah. Are most of the folks in that band, do they work in music outside of the band, or do
it's really a mix. There are clearly those who do music in their careers, but Glenn Williams works in I believe he said property. I don't remember if he said real estate or property development or something, but he's just an excellent euphonium player. And then some of them. So his wife Helen works for Brass Bands England, so it's more administrative creative than actual musical. And the principal trombone works in computers, so it's a mix.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I wish you good luck with that. I look forward to seeing you in some of their new videos. So
Appreciate it.
I'll look at trying to wrap it up here. Appreciate you taking time to speak with me tonight. And hopefully maybe I'll try to get down and catch one of those South Carolina brass band concerts here this spring.
Yeah, we have one coming up. March 9th is our spring concert.
All right, Joel. Well, thanks so much again, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Okay.